Let's move on to another crisis that everyone is very well aware of, and unfortunately, there hasn't been that much of a response to. I'm talking about the housing crisis. Personally, I'm somebody who knows what it's like to not have a home, to not have that kind of security, and I know what that feels like, the kind of desperation and fear and willingness to do anything to make sure that you're able to survive the next week, the next month, right? That's something that stays with you forever. Unfortunately, that's not an experience that is unique to me. It's something that many people in this country experience on a regular basis. And we're going to talk a little bit about housing in general and some of the solutions, that are out there for dealing with this crisis. But I'll tell you right now that we titled this segment, "Could Public Housing Be the Next Medicare for All?" And just as an outline, I'm going to argue it absolutely can be and it should be. One, because it's the right policy in the same way that Medicare for All was the right policy, but it touches so many people that I think that the organizing capacity around housing, around renters justice, tenant justice, etc., really has an opportunity to mobilize people in a way that a lot of other issues can't, especially because it has such a universal background. But we'll break all this down. Let's start a little bit with people's image of public housing in general. When most people think of public housing, they don't think of comfort. They think of underfunded, overpoliced, and surveilled structures. That's by design. It does not have to be this way, and we'll go through some of the other models that show that not only can public housing be much better than it is in the United States, it can actually be beautiful, expressive, and something that the communities take pride in. The war on public housing, like many of the other kind of wars on social goods in this country, started really with the birth of neoliberalism when they were coming out after all of these different public goods. There is no need that public housing need to be neglected and underfunded in the way that it does. And as I was saying a second ago, it can be a bedrock of our community, a symbol, frankly, of our community's wealth and collective prosperity. Breaking down just like what we've seen during this pandemic, in 2021, we saw rents increase nearly 11.4%. The eviction lab, which follows evictions, and it's quite a dark job to do right now as more and more people are being forced out of their homes, as these protections that went in during the pandemic are sort of lifted across the board. They've reported that since March 2020, 707,706 people have been evicted. That's an astronomical number. And remember, there's so much that goes into housing justice, not just getting people in housing, but also getting rid of these black marks that get put on renters, where if you get evicted, that stays on your record and makes it harder and harder for you to secure housing in the future. That's a substantial amount of people, and it never should have happened in the first place. Just last week, there were 8,020 evictions. And just in Houston alone, there were over 2,000 filings for evictions last week. We all know the stats at this point that minimum wage workers can't afford to live practically anywhere in this country. But this is one of those things where we can go through all the numbers, but it's something that most people are familiar with. If not immediately, they know people around them who are very much struggling to stay in their homes and are seeing more and more of their income being gobbled up by rent. This, unfortunately, is not a new phenomenon in this country, which is why we're going to talk about a very specific solution to this problem, which is social housing, versus some of the kind of more progressive and liberal solutions to these problems. Not that those things aren't worthwhile in supporting, right? And not that just also advocating for an increase in housing stock in this country isn't worth supporting on some level. But you have to understand that the profit motive ends up gobbling up all of these kind of, of all of these other all of these other intentions that you may have. I mean, we've seen what happens when you just sort of pursue building for building's sake. You see it in cities like New York, you see it in cities like Austin, you see it in cities like San Francisco, where certainly there are the NIMBYs, right? Um, but this is a very classic thing that we do in this culture, where we find a social problem, right? And instead of actually addressing the root cause of this problem, the root cause of this problem is private ownership of housing at the expense of public ownership of housing. And we come up with the villain and a kind of cheap answer and a cheap solution to this. When you look at what ends up happening with a lot of these new buildings that are built up across the country, the vast majority of them are for people at the very, very top end of the income bracket. Because if you are trying to make money from a space, you want to maximize the amount of profit that you can get, right? And we try all these really cute and clever schemes where we say you have to have this much at market rate. But what we've seen, people find loopholes, and these market rate thresholds in the first place are not adequate, for what we need. Again, I'm not saying not to develop new housing where it's needed. There's lots of parts of the country where there is too many single family homes and not multifamily housing. I'm not saying that, the kind of generalized criticisms of people who are against any kind of new development in general are incorrect. But I'm going to tell you right now that the NIMBY, if you are sitting here and listening to this crisis and thinking about this crisis, and you think that the sole problem are these, quote unquote NIMBYs, you've been sold a lie, because this is a very, very old problem in this country. And we have this video, unless you had anything you wanted to add to that, Matt.
I would just comment briefly on, like, as something, the new Medicare for all. Like, we've seen success from people do the, we talked to GP Jacob in Minneapolis. St. Paul was very successful getting people to turn out for rent control. Robin Wonsley Warloba on the city council pushing that in Minneapolis, and also Julia Salazar here in New York was a tenant organizer before she ran on like a DSA back ticket. And like, and I just say, like, the Minneapolis experience particularly proved to me that, like, when you actually are knocking doors and talking about what people are concerned about, surprise, it's all this shit that bubbles up in all these cultural, like you said, like the NIMBY, sort of like that sort of cultural shit. But there's an actual concern there that needs to be met.
Yeah, and again, and even with the NIMBY thing, just to be really explicit on this too, y'all. Again, the NIMBY thing, the NIMBY thing obscures why there's a tension between people who want, more multifamily housing versus single family housing, and that's property values. That's profit motive, right? Again, like, if you're getting fixated on this kind of cultural current, right, this character in your head, the NIMBY, right, and not, housing for profit creates contradictions, for people in general, you are making a big mistake.
Yeah, two contradictions. All right, one diction here. Housing should be a place where people live and shelter them. The other diction. Housing is an asset that you want to appreciate and value, so you can, like, get out of this hellhole of America, right, where you can't pay for healthcare and education, right? Those are the two contradictions, and you have to pick one. And we've picked one, and that's an asset that is going to, and that's why you see homelessness, right? Like, that's the decision we are making actively.
And let's play this real quick. This is what I believe from the 70s in San Francisco, a city that, very much has been at the front lines of this conflict for a long while. And this is getting really clearly, I think, into the problem of the profit motive when it comes to housing.
There's a new look to San Francisco. On the heels of the Manhattanization of downtown, speculation in housing is changing the face of the city. Rapid and repeated turnovers of residential property are driving up rents, and many San Franciscans find they can't afford to live in their own neighborhoods. The Mission District, one of the few low-rent areas left in the city, is currently a target for speculators. Attracted by low property values and proximity to downtown, speculators buy buildings cheap, make cosmetic repairs, and sell them quickly for huge profits. A recent survey of the mission found that apartment buildings changed hands on an average of every 18 months, and the biggest profits were made when property was turned over in less than a year. Buildings are bought and sold to maximize profit without regard for their use.
And that right there is the fundamental contradiction between, to use some Marxist terms, the use value and the exchange value, right? And the use value, as Matt was noting earlier, a space for people to live, to reproduce social life, to come home to at the end of the working day, to be a shelter, right? A concept that most people can understand. And the other use of the exchange value of the unit, which is something that you use to hold as an investment to make profit from when you're able to sell it, for more. And like at the end of the day, what we've seen in cities all across this country, and again, actually, I don't want to make this seem like it's just an American problem, which again, I think goes to show that all the people who try to make it a cultural argument again are like making a very big mistake, because it's London, it's Paris, it's Moscow, it's Seattle, it's New York, it's Austin, Houston, etc. Right? This is a fundamental problem, and there has been an influx of asset price inflation when it comes to housing, especially over the past 20 years. And the main factor, we'll get into that in a second, has been that interest rates have been very, very low, which allow organizations to basically be able to buy up large amounts of housing, which for the most part is, it's not a sure bet, but it's a pretty safe investment. I'll tell you, down the road for me, Austin is certainly another city that's in a housing crisis, and we need way more affordable housing, and I would argue social housing being built here. But what you're seeing being built is these kind of high-end luxury apartment buildings. More often than not, they sit empty because people use them as as investment properties to then try to sell as the market continues to inflate more and more around here. I live in a very working class part of Austin, actually very close to a kind of like warehouse district. A large section of that has been bought up by a bunch of developers. And they're going to be building these luxury condos, which is ridiculous in this neighborhood. When people don't typically live in these kind of fancy schmancy places. The average price for these is $350,000 a year for a condo, right? Again, this is a place where you can get a house. A condo for $350 is ridiculous. $350 and more. That's like the one bedroom versus like the suite. It's sold out every unit in it before they put a shovel in the dirt, right? I mean, it's just gravel over there right now. This to me shows that there is a huge disconnect again between like the social value of building and the exchange value, right? What people are hoping to make out of it from selling it in the future. You're muted, man. I'm sorry.
When you have developers so in charge of like municipal governments, for instance, what's their incentive? Is there incentive to build a whole bunch of adequate housing for people so like we're going to get an adequate supply for people? No, it's to not. It's to build certain kind of stuff that they can, like you say, like appeal to the inequality of society and get some of that big luxury rent spent.
Well, exactly. And also like this is, people always like to use terms like we're going to do capitalism with a conscience, right? You remember that one, the Whole Foods CEO. This is one of those things when you have a system that prioritizes a certain kind of activity, right? Which is making money. People who are in that business are going to try to make as much money as possible. As I said earlier, if you own a property, you're going to try to be able to take as much value out of that, to take as much profit out of that as possible. You don't care about what the social value of that is to the community. You're capitalists. You're in this kind of thing to get paid. And this is why the model that we've taken in neoliberal America has failed dramatically at this problem. There has been issues with us being able to increase the housing supply, but also this fantasy that we're going to get the market to work for us. We really need to disabuse people of that model. So you can just, briefly, in the United States, there's a sort of exciting moment with public housing. It doesn't take off in the same way that it did in Europe. Very soon, though, government-owned housing, buildings that the government is making to then rent out at lower rates than market rates to people, And that starts to decline as more and more people are sort of pushed into Section 8, right? Which is a system where you're essentially subsidizing low income working class people to pay a potentially a nonprofit, but more often than not, a private, an owner of a private building, right? Again, and this is the kind of thing you're just locking people into that kind of system, which has had this effect across the board in this country, where rents continue to go up despite wages staying stagnant and rent gobbling up more and more and more of people's income. Let's get to the solution here, because it's very simple, but there's an important argument to be made. The solution is public and social housing. Um, what do we mean by this? It means that we are having housing that is owned by the government, by the community, the extension of us as members of a democracy. And those, they could be different institutions. It could be the state, it could be the city, it could be the federal government. I would prefer to see, a model of all three, with more and more of federal funding going in to foot the bill. And we'll talk about the ways that that can be done later. Because I'll tell you right now, while we see some kind of pathways potentially in New York and California, it's going to be a very long time before you're able to get state governments, I think, across the South and Texas, places that really, really need it. Um, that kind of influx to do it. So we need to have an approach that is hitting on municipal, state, and federal funding. But let's get into social housing right now. There was an essay that was put out by the People's Policy Project in 2017. I'm going to pull it up right quick for y'all. Put out by Ryan Cooper and Saoirse Gowan, whose name I think I pronounced correctly. I apologize if I didn't. Called "The Solution is Social Housing," and this is an excerpt from their longer piece in the People's Policy Project. But they make a strong argument here, so let me read a little bit from it. Many American cities face a severe shortage of affordable housing, and not just for the poor, but well up into the upper middle class. A recent report from Harvard's Center for Housing Studies concluded the rental market thus appears to be settling into a new normal, where nearly half of renter households are cost burdened, or paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Damn, 30% sounds nice. What those cities need is a dramatic increase in the number of mid-range and affordable dwellings to ease the price pressure on the rental markets. They should address the problem directly by constructing a large number of government-owned municipal housing developments. Unlike traditional American public housing, all city residents will be eligible to live there. And this is the bit that's really important about social housing. As I opened up with, the public housing system in this country failed dramatically. It failed because it wasn't ambitious enough. It failed because neoliberal politicians and right-wing politicians wanted to use it as a place to surveil and punish the poor for being poor. But it also failed because these problems were not universal. These solutions were not universal. And you look at American history, when we don't pursue universal programs, there is a lot of openings for scapegoating and undermining of the core value of these solutions. So, laying out the argument that they make in this piece here, we need to see in cities more mid-range and affordable dwellings. No doubt about that. How can we do that? Is by constructing large numbers of government-owned municipal housing developments and making those eligible to everybody. So you would apply to live into social housing, and depending on the income, how much money you make, your rent would be adjusted accordingly. So if you are an upper middle class person or a middle class person, you might be paying a little bit more than your neighbor, but you would still be paying less than the market rates in general, right? This kind of system allows for cities, one, to be able to raise the revenues to maintain those programs, and allows us to subsidize the housing for those who really, really need that extra bit of help, while also providing a new stock of affordable housing for the vast majority of people. The system that we have right now is all about creating high-end apartment buildings that, as we were saying earlier, are typically only used as investment properties, or for the people, and the people who actually are living in them are people who are. It's not a system that we've seen that really trickle down to the rest of us, right? We haven't seen in areas where they've increased the luxury housing supply, typical housing and apartments in those communities becoming more affordable for people. In fact, we've seen quite the opposite. So what we need is a system that increases the supply, right? But also provides us a mechanism to make sure that it's normal people, middle class people, working class people who are living in them. And the system is very, very simple. There are versions of this all around the world, the most famous obviously being Vienna, where I believe something like 60% of people live in social public housing, right? And again, you pay it as a percentage of your income. So some people pay more, some people pay less, but the housing that they have there is absolutely beautiful. People have a stronger sense of community, and we're able to be much, much more creative with their space.
That's amazing. I didn't know Vienna had that. Vienna, that notorious hellhole.
Well, I mean, that's that's what happens when you have 100 years of socialist movements here. But we'll get into the politics in just one second. I mean, if you want to introduce this this clip we have, Matt, I think that.
Well, we got two. So this has gotten attention from our friends on the right. The right is in disarray, if you can believe it, over the issue of housing being bought up by capitalists. Here is Will Witt. He's PragerU's new boy,
Little genius boy.
Yeah, he's a really smart kid. And they shared this, which was, I noted this. This is interesting coming from the right. Your future in America is being destroyed and controlled by BlackRock. And there was this cultural husbandry, all these weird right-wing sort of accounts like cultural husbandies. BlackRock is buying every single family house they can find, paying 20 to 50% above asking price and outbidding normal home buyers. Why? First of all, why are they asking above the asking price? I get that they can because of what we're going to talk about, but it seems like an oversight. But why are corporations, pension funds?
Well, because then when they sell it later, they say this is how much it was bought for.
Gotcha, smart. And so here is Ben Shapiro.
And also just so people understand the mechanism, they also buy a bunch in the neighborhood. So then it's like, oh, this neighborhood is really hot. The price of housing in this neighborhood has gone up 20%, and then it's BlackRock or one of the real estate, Zillow or one of them was also doing this, I believe, too.
Right. I did hear about that. So here's Ben Shapiro taking Will Witt to task. I mean, he doesn't say it by name, but you can tell that this is where this is aimed.
You're seeing people get ticked off at corporations for doing what exactly it is that they do, which is they see a cheap debt instrument available to them, and they immediately start taking out loans and then buying up hard assets. Now, there are people get angry at the corporations for this. You're getting angry at the wrong people. I may not like it either, but the point is that unless you stop the Federal Reserve from pumping money into the system, corporations are going to take cheap loans, and then they're going to use those loans to arbitrage. They're going to take the loans at 0%, and then they're either going to lend it out at 3%, or they're going to go buy hard assets they think are going to appreciate at 3% or more over the course of the next 50 years. This is leading to massive price inflation, especially in real estate. So there's a big story that came out yesterday, and a lot of people right, left, and center are really mad about it. And this is where populists go wrong. Not because they are wrong in being angry about things, but because very often they're angry at the wrong people. Okay, it is not a corporation's fault if cheap loans are available, that they are taking the cheap loans and then going and buying real estate. Any more than it would be their fault if cheap loans are available and they go and they take the cheap loans and then they buy stock. Okay, it is the fault. This all comes down to government policy.
What do you say, David?
Well, I'll say this. I don't think that you should save your moral fire, hold your moral fire against BlackRock or any company that is doing things to inflate prices of socially needed goods. But you know what? Ben is onto something here. That is what business does. And that is why business and capitalism is a predatory institution on social goods in our society. But no, Ben is again, he's wrong about saying that you shouldn't be upset or mad at BlackRock because You should be. But if you're trying to appeal to BlackRock, like you're going to get really mad at BlackRock, and BlackRock's going to say, "Oh, well, we're going to stop being an entity that is about making profit." You're absolutely delusional. And again, Ben, of course, is trying to turn this on the government. I'll tell you right now, the solution to this problem is very simple. Yes, the reason that we have seen all of these big firms buying up the vast majority of housing stock in this country is because interest rates are low, and it's a pretty safe bet that these kind of values are going to appreciate. So guess what? Instead of sitting on our asses and complaining about it, we could come up with a solution. We should be utilizing interest rates from the Federal Reserve, and having that funding being delivered directly to municipalities and government organizations to buy up housing stock across the country, to buy up land across the country, and to build on that land big, beautiful social housing that provides homes to many, and value to our communities, because it means that more and more people can continue to live in our society, and it allows us to do something that is very, very good: planning. We can plan communities, and we can have areas and cities be designed in a much, much more orderly way, where you have housing and business, and having more like kind of like town centers and things like that, instead of God love it. But instead of big freeways, and kind of Houstonification of parts of the country, right? So again, Ben is obviously a bad actor, and he's trying to get you to turn to say like, "Oh, what we need is less regulation here, and if we had less regulation, then things would be better, and the market will work its way out eventually if you get rid of cheap interest rates from the Federal Reserve." One, the end result of that is disastrous, and thank God that we have a system of central banking in this country. It does not work for working people, but boy, it prevents massive, massive financial collapse. If you look at the history of early America, every time you had one of these kind of recessions, it turned into a full-blown depression. And again, we can make the Federal Reserve and these systems work more for us than they do. But this kind of right-wing desire to absolutely smash them, frankly, is suicidal. But secondly, what we should be advocating for is smart use of these kind of the ability of the federal government to be able to provide all of these kind of loans. I mean, think about how much money was given out to corporations through the Paycheck Protection Program. And I don't know, Branko Marcic wrote a really great piece in Jacobin noting just how wasteful that program ended up being, because the vast majority of people who were taking out those loans weren't utilizing them to make sure that people were staying in their jobs. They were using them to line their pockets, right? We have incredible capacity, is what I'm saying, as a government in the system, to put money into the system, but it always seems to go to the same kind of people. So as people in this democracy, as people in the society, we need to be building the political movements to demand these things. And again, I think that these have a lot of potential to do a lot of good and create a lot of kind of good radical social change, but these aren't that radical of ideas, frankly. Like, this is just good policy. We have a housing crisis, we have the funding mechanism, and we can provide people with housing in a way that helps out everybody, provides jobs for people to be able to work those buildings, provides jobs for people to be able to build those buildings. We can make those buildings green, right? Like, the possibilities are endless. This could be a massive win for Joe Biden and the Democrats. Now, of course, they'll never do it unless there are mass social movements that are demanding it. And this is why, going back to the opening title of this clip, housing is one of those things where the pain that we see, the houselessness that we see, the suffering that we see is a choice. We have the solutions. We have the capability to do something different. All we need is to force those in power to respond to these demands. And what we can do in the meantime is make these arguments very, very clear to folks, right? Because it's very simple. And it's not that crazy. I think most people can wrap their heads around why social housing makes sense, and how we can do it, and how we could do it in the immediate future, not like 20 years down the line living under socialism. You could do this under the system that we have today. And two, the most immediate thing that you can do is to join your local left-wing organization or tenant union, because I know organizations from Socialist Alternative to DSA are already out there organizing for these kind of things in their community, right? These are the ways that we can start to build different models and different ideas and different horizons for people, and we absolutely need to be taking advantage of them.
Yeah, Kansas City Tenants also got a really good group going there, stand up for against evictions. And one thing that should be mentioned is, the Ben Shapiro saying like, "Oh, these corporations, they just have to take all the money," and it's that Barack Obama, one of the worst things on his domestic legacy is his response to the housing crisis that saw people evicted en masse when there were absolute policy things that he himself promised. The cram down was one thing, but this entire money funnel you're talking about that we just spray at banks, we could have put that to use for homeowners like you're talking about, and we decided to do it for the banks. And that's why we should be mad at banks also, yes. Right? Right. Like this idea that we should just be mad at the government, that's the boss speaking through little Benny Shapiro's mouth, because this is all bankers and how they control the government. Anyways.
Yeah. And like, there's so much, I mean, again, there's so many different models we can pursue. I still think socially controlled in the form of municipal state, and federal government is the way to go. Community land trusts are an option. I know a lot of people in New York have been trying to pursue those, that as a way to start building these kind of social housing. I mean, these are things that we can do. I do think that we need to have the big money, cannons and faucets, and basically have as much state capacity and power to implement that as possible. So, again, I'm happy to see any other models as long as they're, feasible. But I do think that trying to take the big guns and using those is the best way to move forward. But again, this is a really exciting opportunity that's out there. It comes out of a very dark problem. But this is the way that I think, a lot of people ask us, like, what can we do to get involved? And I always say, join a socialist organization. I would highly suggest joining the DSA. And two, start thinking about what the needs are in your community. And I think at this point, I can confidently say that there probably is not a community in this country we're talking about housing justice in these kind of big and bold ways isn't something that can get people motivated to seeing politics as an avenue, as a potential place to change their lives for the better. Right. And this is the kind of thing that instead of sitting on our asses after a big defeat with, Bernie and a lot of the kind of strategies that we pursued in the 2010s and in that decade, this is how we can start to think of different ways to organize our power to be able to fight for a much better future.